Texas, midday summer. The sun scorched down on the cracked earth of the Fort Worth stockyards, where the scent of dry hay, cow dung, and the clatter of transport trucks blended into the air. Men in cowboy hats, faded jeans, and sweat-stained shirts went about their familiar work, loading cattle onto trucks, pushing each bull through iron gates, preparing them for processing. In the midst of this weary atmosphere, a gleaming black Rolls-Royce parked at the entrance, as if it had taken a wrong turn from Beverly Hills and ended up in the southern fields. When the door opened, a man stepped out. Edward, 78 years old. His silver hair was slicked back perfectly. A charcoal three-piece suit. A Patek Philippe watch on his wrist. The entire area seemed to pause for a beat. Jake Rodriguez, the longtime foreman of the ranch, chewing on a cigarette, spat on the ground and squinted. Swear to God, what the hell is this? A damn oil king get lost on his way to a cattle plant? The workers paused. A few chuckled. The sight of a billionaire stepping across cow manure without so much as a grimace, now that was something no one expected. A young chauffeur rushed to follow. Anxious. Mr. Edward, are you sure you don't want to wait in the car while I take care of it for you? Edward didn't turn around. His voice was deep, clear, with the authority of a man who once ran a multi-billion-dollar financial empire. No, Thomas. I need to see with my own eyes. And so he walked on. Italian leather shoes sinking into the muddy earth mixed with hay, leaving behind a trail of stares, part mocking, part intrigued. Whispers rippled through the men. Maybe he lost a bet. Probably shooting some reality TV show, Billionaire Goes Country. Or maybe, the old man's gone mad. But Edward paid them no mind. His cold steel blue eyes scanned each pen, each stretch of iron fencing. Passed over bulls worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Passed over prize-winning rodeo studs. None of them made him stop. Until a large man with calloused hands approached. Bob Crawford, the head manager of the ranch, spoke with half formality, half curiosity. Good afternoon, sir. I'm Crawford, manager here. Apologies if this sounds blunt, but may I ask what brings you here? We typically sell in bulk, not like the boutique auctions. Edward stopped, said little, just looked Crawford square in the eye. I'm looking for a specific bull. It was brought here recently. Possibly already removed from the processing list. I need to see it with my own eyes. Crawford frowned. That section would be the coal pen, just old bulls with no meat value left. Some can't even stand. I'm afraid you might be in the wrong place. Edward gave a subtle nod. Take me there. His voice wasn't loud, but it made the entire pen fall silent. A kind of authority not born from shouting, but from a past powered by something far greater guiding his steps. And so he walked forward. Into a place no wealthy man had ever set foot, the pen of forgotten creatures. Waiting for the day they would be put down. Crawford led Edward down a long corridor thick with the stench of urine, mildew, and the groans of cattle mixed with the clattering hum of old fans. This was the coal pen, where once valuable creatures now lingered as hollow shells, quietly awaiting their fate. As he opened the gate, Crawford muttered under his breath, "This is where it ends for them. Most'll be loaded for processing this week, the ones too weak? They just die right here." Edward didn't react, but his eyes were searching intently. Eyes that had spent decades in the ruthless world of finance now held something softer, not the gaze of an investor, but of a man reaching for a piece of a past he thought was gone. Then, he stopped. At the far end of the row, beneath a flickering yellow light, lay a massive bull, its once thick black coat now caked with mud and patchy with hair loss. One horn broken, a hind leg swollen, infected, oozing pus. Its breathing was labored, ribs visible beneath gaunt flanks, each rise and fall of its chest a struggle against death. Crawford spoke softly, almost with pity. That one came in 3 days ago. Its owner went bankrupt, handed it over along with a bunch of worn-out stock. We scheduled it for pickup next week. It's too weak. Vet said it's not even suitable for slaughter. But Edward heard nothing more. He had already let his expensive coat fall to the ground and stepped up to the fence. His hand clenched the metal bar so tightly his knuckles turned white. Sweat rolled down his forehead. But he didn't move. His eyes never left the struggling animal on the other side. No one understood why, until Edward spoke. his voice barely more than a breath across the surface of memory. Toro Negro? A few workers burst out laughing. Say what? Toro Negro? Wasn't that legendary bull dead since the 80s? Old man's hallucinating, heat's cooking his brain. But the older ones fell silent. A name, no matter how distant, still had the power to stop the hearts of those who had once witnessed the golden age of rodeo. Toro Negro. The beast that had thrown off nearly every cowboy in Texas. They said it could twist midair, fling a rider like a napkin caught in the wind. A single toss from it could leave a cowboy in the hospital for 3 months. And Edward, once just a young man named Eddie, had been one of its most famous victims. A brutal throw in Houston, 1974, had shattered 3 ribs, collapsed a lung, and nearly killed him on the dusty arena floor. But after that accident, the poor boy never returned to the ring. He became a businessman, then an investor, then a millionaire, and finally a billionaire. Yet no one knew, deep down, he had never let go of a promise made long ago. Edward slowly climbed over the fence. Crawford panicked. What are you doing? That thing could react at any moment, even dying. It's strong enough to kill a man. Edward turned his head, voice calm and steady. It won't hurt me. He stepped forward, his shoes sinking into the muck, hand trembling as he reached out, and then sat down beside the bull. The creature slowly turned its head. Its clouded eyes suddenly lit up. A long, trembling breath, and then it bellowed softly. Not a roar of rage, but a sound filled with feeling. A sound that felt almost like recognition. Edward touched its forehead, right where a faint crescent-shaped scar lay. A mark only 2 beings from the same lifetime could understand. And he whispered, I promised, I would come back for you. No matter how long it took. Silence fell over the entire cattle pen, not the silence of apathy, but the stillness of people who had just witnessed something inexplicable. The younger workers still didn't understand what was happening. But the older ones, those who had lived through the era when Toro Negro reigned over the Texas rodeo arenas, no longer doubted. Crawford approached slowly, as if afraid to break something sacred unfolding before his eyes. You're saying, this bull is Toro Negro? Edward didn't look away from the animal, his hand gently stroking the patchy, diseased fur on its neck. No doubt about it, the crescent-shaped scar on the side of his neck. I carved that myself when he was just a calf. I used to work at Broken Arrow Ranch to earn money for rodeo competitions. Toro was the first bull I ever trained, and the last one to throw me. Crawford stood speechless. Behind him, some workers murmured, I can't believe it, that's a living legend. And now, dying here like scrap. Edward slowly closed his eyes, remembering the years of red dust and roaring crowds, when Toro Negro was every cowboy's nightmare. But he didn't just remember the pain, the brutal toss that nearly killed him. He remembered what happened after that match, when Toro was led back to the rest pen. And he, still just a young man lying on a stretcher, turned his head and saw the bull look back at him. The gaze wasn't wild or hostile, it was calm, like a silent acknowledgement between 2 warriors. And in that moment, in a hospital bed, he had made a vow he would never forget. One day, if you're still alive, I'll find you. And I won't let you die in pain or be forgotten. Now, that vow was standing before him, vivid, agonizing, and more real than ever, in the old, dying body of Toro Negro. A female veterinarian stepped forward, clipboard in hand, her voice cautious. Sir, if this really is Toro Negro, then according to the records, this bull would be over 50 years old. That's almost impossible. Edward lifted his head, his eyes gleaming. It's not impossible. It's just that no one expects someone to keep a promise after half a century. Crawford flipped through the inventory ledger, finding a scribbled note next to the bull's entry. Male bull, age unknown. Weight 1,700 pounds. Status: cull. From bankrupt ranch in Oklahoma. Handwritten note. Real name, Toro Negro. If a man named Edward Winston is still alive, tell him. Toro never forgot. Edward's entire body trembled. Miguel, he whispered. Toro's old trainer. He kept his word. He kept Toro alive all these years, waiting for me. No one said another word. Crawford looked into Edward's eyes, then silently removed his hat and bowed his head. Mr. Winston, what would you like us to do with the animal? Edward rose to his feet. though his knees were caked in mud and his $1,000 shoes soaked in manure. His voice thundered. "I didn't come here to negotiate. I came to keep my word. Call the veterinary medical team. Call an airlift crew. Call whoever is the best in large animal care. Toro Negro will not die here. Not in despair. Not in loneliness." And as if time had reversed to some long-forgotten era, the rugged men in dusty clothes watched Edward, an old gentleman standing beside an old bull, and they no longer saw a billionaire. They saw a man who kept his promise. And a creature who had once been a legend, now about to die as a legend. When Edward Winston pulled out his phone to make the call, everyone around him remained still, as if any movement might dissolve the moment into dust beneath the Texas sun. His voice, low but resolute, rose above the usual clatter of the stockyard. "Thomas, call Dr. Elizabeth Morrison at the Texas A&M College of Veterinary Medicine. Tell her Edward Winston needs an emergency medical team for a critically ill large animal. They have 60 minutes to get airborne. Prepare the helicopter transport to the ranch." On the other end, Thomas, the chauffeur, didn't ask a single question. He was used to his employer's strange commands, but never before had he heard that slight tremble in Edward's voice. It wasn't fear. It was something deeper. Love. Regret. Memory. Within the hour, the normally loud and chaotic cattle yard had transformed into a stage of disbelief. An animal ambulance arrived first, followed by a light helicopter landing in the dusty back lot, kicking up thick clouds of red earth. Local reporters began to swarm in, drawn by a rumor spreading like wildfire. Billionaire Edward Winston is rescuing a bull, and calling it Toro Negro, the old rodeo legend. While the crowd gathered, Edward never left the pen. He sat beside Toro, hand resting gently on the bull's forehead, whispering, "I came back, Toro. You waited, and now, I won't let you go in cold and silence." The chopper thundered above, while the veterinary team worked quickly to set up a field tent and IV systems. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, one of the nation's leading large animal specialists, arrived on site, took one glance at Toro's condition, and frowned. "I need to be honest with you, Mr. Winston. Toro's body is riddled with infection. Joints are inflamed, and there's necrosis in his left leg. We might be able to extend his life a few days, if we're lucky, but to save him completely? That's near impossible." Edward simply nodded. "I'm not asking you to save a legend. I just want him to die like a king." That one sentence brought the entire medical team to a halt. As the sunset painted the sky in dusty gold, Toro was gently lifted using specialized equipment and carefully placed into a transport trailer lined with fresh straw and surrounded by medical monitors. News cameras had arrived, but when a reporter asked for a statement, Edward saw only one sentence. "This isn't about me. It's about the bull who taught me how to stand up after the greatest fall of my life." The entire stockyard stood still as Toro was taken away. No one laughed anymore. No one doubted anything. In their eyes, a legend was being carried home, not to a slaughterhouse, but to a field full of sunlight and fresh grass. And beside him was a man no longer young, but who had never forgotten a single promise made half a century ago. The helicopter carrying Edward Winston and Toro Negro lifted off from Fort Worth as the golden sunset bathed the Texas sky. Below, the news had already spread. Short clips showing Edward kneeling beside the old bull, his hand resting gently on its forehead, eyes filled with emotion, had begun to circulate across social media. When they landed on the southern stretch of Winston Ranch, over 10,000 acres of open pasture, staff had already set up a field care station near a hillside where Edward used to sit and watch the sun go down. It was the very place he had once dreamed of, that if he ever had the chance, he would bring Toro here. Now, that chance, though late, had become real. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison and her medical team quickly got to work. IV fluids, antibiotics, wound cleaning. They weren't fighting to prolong life in vain. They were fighting for a few last moments of peace, of dignity. Edward, instead of overseeing like a typical billionaire, chose to stay beside Toro. Hour after hour, night after night, he set up a folding bed right next to the pen, used his own suit jacket as a pillow for the legendary bull, and began to tell old stories, as if they had never been apart. "You remember, Toro, that rodeo in Amarillo, 8 seconds? I barely lasted 3. The bull snorted softly. Faint sounds rose from its throat, almost like a reply. Dr. Morrison turned quietly to her assistant and whispered, "I've never seen emotional response like this in a bull. There's something here that science can't explain." On that first night, Edward didn't sleep. He gazed at the starlit sky, occasionally glancing down at Toro, resting peacefully in clean straw. Around the bull's neck now hung a thin, embroidered cloth reading, El Toro Negro, the pride, and the promise kept. The next morning, reporters crowded the ranch gates. Live TV, magazines, international news outlets, all wanted the story of the billionaire who kept his promise to a legendary bull. But Edward refused to appear. "They don't need to hear about me," he told his media manager. "Tell them about Toro, about the four-legged warriors who made history, and were never given credit for it." When Toro managed to chew a few bites of fresh grass, slow but unassisted, applause broke out among those watching. The story had evolved beyond a media sensation. It had become a symbol of friendship, honor, and a promise that defied time. And Edward Winston, the man who once conquered the heights of the business world, now had only one pursuit left: to keep his promise to the creature who taught him how to rise after his greatest fall. 3 days had passed since Toro Negro was brought back to Winston Ranch. The miraculous reunion between a billionaire and an aging bull had made headlines across the country, but to Edward, the outside world had become little more than distant noise. He was still there every night, by the side of the creature who had once thrown him into agony, and also the creature who had changed his fate forever. That morning, Dr. Morrison gave an update. "Toro is recovering in a way that defies explanation. We didn't think he'd ever stand on his own again. But this morning, he tried to lift his left leg." Edward wasn't surprised. He simply smiled. He's always done the things no one believed he could. But that very afternoon, while Edward was gently drying Toro's forehead with an old silk cloth, Mr. Jenkins, the ranch manager, walked in holding a crumpled envelope. "Mr. Winston, we just found this letter in the old records from Broken Arrow Ranch." Edward opened it. Inside was a yellowed piece of paper, handwritten, shaky but filled with emotion. The first line stunned him. "If Harry Winston is still alive, please tell him that Toro Negro never forgot." Signed at the bottom, Miguel Ramirez. The old trainer, the man who had raised Toro like his own son. And the same man who had once carried Edward to safety after that life-changing fall. Edward's voice broke. Miguel kept his promise. He cared for Toro all these years, waiting for me to return. Memories rushed back. The fall in Houston, 1974. The roar of the crowd. The sharp pain of broken ribs puncturing his lung. Miguel, drenched in Edward's blood, had thrown him over his shoulder and whispered, "You live, kid, and one day, come back. He's a warrior, but so are you." Edward clutched the letter tightly. He looked at Toro and understood. This was no longer about obligation. This was destiny. He hadn't returned just to keep a promise. He had returned for a part of his soul, left behind long ago in the sound of horns slamming dust and the scent of dry Texas wind. That very night, Edward summoned his private media team. "We're going to create the Toro Negro Foundation. And the first video I want is about a forgotten man named Miguel, and the bull who once carried the dream of a kid named Harry Winston on his back." And so, a legacy began, a promise between man and beast. A fragment of memory turned into light, shining across the world, and a crescent-shaped scar, a mark that would never be forgotten. The next morning, the Texas sun burned as fiercely as ever. But the atmosphere at Winston Ranch had shifted. Across the quiet fields, trucks from television stations, animal rescue organizations, and curious strangers began to arrive, all drawn in by the strange tale of a billionaire who returned to honor a promise to a bull. But to Edward, only one name mattered above all: Miguel Ramirez. He stood inside Miguel's old office, a small wooden cabin tucked deep behind the trees at the back of the ranch, blanketed in dust and fallen leaves from years of abandonment. On the decaying desk, faded photographs remained. Miguel as a young man, standing beside a playful black calf. Toro Negro. On the wall, hanging silently, was an old cowboy hat, weathered from years under the sun. And behind the brim, scribbled in rough handwriting, Miguel had written, "Toro isn't just a bull. He's memory. He's promise." Edward sat silently in that room for hours. No one disturbed him. No one dared. When he finally stepped outside, the media team had finished setting up the backdrop for a short documentary video, the opening message of the newly founded Toro Negro Foundation, dedicated to protecting retired performance animals, the ones who had once carried human glory on their backs but were so often forgotten in the fading twilight of their lives. Edward stood before the nation and made his declaration. We have championships for men, medals for victory. But what of the souls who carried us there, like Toro Negro? I didn't start this foundation out of pity. I started it out of gratitude. And I want to begin by telling the story of Miguel, the man who kept a creature alive for 50 years, just to keep a promise made to a kid who once fell off a bull. The story spread like wildfire through the prairie. The press called it the half-century promise. People across Texas flocked to the ranch, not just to see Toro Negro, but to lay their hands on Miguel's grave, which Edward had placed right beside Toro's resting place. A modest stone marker, engraved with the words, Miguel Ramirez, keeper of what others didn't see. You kept your promise. Now it's our turn. And at night, when all the lights had gone out, Edward once again sat beside Toro, his voice low and warm. Today, you're not just a legend, Toro. You're a symbol of all that the world forgets. But from now on, no one will be forgotten again. 3 days had passed since Toro Negro was brought back to the ranch. And though the veterinary team had done everything possible, Edward knew time was running out. Toro ate very little, breathed with difficulty, but those deep, dark eyes still opened each time Edward approached, and, as always, the bull would only truly rest when Edward's hand lay gently on his forehead. That afternoon, the Texas sky was cloudless. The sun blazed like a giant flame over the golden prairie. The vet team approved Toro's final outing, to the great pasture where he had first been trained as a calf. A specialized cart gently carried Toro out of the field hospital, and Edward walked beside him, not leaving for a single step. They chose a high grassy hill that overlooked the entire ranch, a place where the sunset would fall directly into Toro's eyes. As if nature itself had opened its arms to bid farewell. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, the head veterinarian, stepped up to Edward, eyes rimmed red. Mr. Winston, I think Toro's waiting for something. Maybe a goodbye. Edward gave a slight nod. Then he sat down, leaned his forehead against Toro's, and whispered, Do you remember? Back then, I was just a skinny, broke kid, clinging to 8 seconds in the arena to earn enough to save my parents' farm. You threw me like lightning, Toro, but when I was lying there barely breathing, you walked over and rested your head against me. As if you knew, I wasn't just an opponent. I was someone fighting to survive. 50 years later, I still remember. And today, I kept my promise. At that exact moment, a miracle occurred. Toro, who had lain almost motionless the entire day, slowly lifted his head. Painfully but deliberately, he looked straight into the burning sunset. The orange-red light gleamed across his faded black coat, making him appear like a statue of iron set ablaze by the final fire of day. Toro turned his head and leaned into Edward's shoulder. Once, twice, and then, he exhaled. One final time. No roar, no struggle, only absolute silence, like a warrior who had fought his last battle, and had now earned his rest. Edward didn't cry. He sat there for a long time, his hand resting on the bull's forehead. In silence, the staff stood several meters away, all with heads bowed. Even the press put down their cameras. In that moment, a man and a bull vanished from the world, together. Later, after the sun had set, Edward stood and turned to Dr. Morrison. Bury Toro here, at the top of this hill. No lavish monument, just a stone, and the truth of what he was. A warrior, a teacher, and an old friend. The next morning, a thin veil of mist blanketed Edward Winston's vast ranch, like a pure white shroud covering the emptiness left behind by the previous evening's sunset. Toro Negro was gone, but not in silence. News of the billionaire who kept a 50-year-old promise to a bull spread like wildfire. From national news networks to global social media platforms, the image of Edward sitting beside Toro in their final moment had become iconic. The hashtag a promise kept surpassed tens of millions of shares in under 24 hours. The New York Times ran the headline, Toro Negro and the Apprentice, A story not about wealth, but honor. But to Edward, fame was never the point. That morning, he stood at Toro's grave, his hand resting on the simple engraved stone. Toro Negro, 1970–2024. The teacher who never spoke, but taught me how to rise. Beside him stood Dr. Morrison, her eyes still red from lack of sleep, but filled with a fire of resolve. We want to continue, she said, not just to save Toro, but all the others like him, animals who were once legends. Then left to fade away in pain. Edward gave a quiet nod. He had been thinking about it all night. That afternoon, he made a public announcement. I am establishing the Toro Negro Foundation, with an initial endowment of $50 million. The mission of this foundation is to find, rescue, and rehabilitate animals who once served in rodeos, farms, or circuses, and to give them the dignity they deserve in their final days. But he didn't stop there. Edward also announced a documentary project titled, Toro, the Bull That Taught Me Everything, to be directed by an Oscar-winning filmmaker. The film would include dramatized footage based on Edward's real life, from a 19-year-old boy thrown into the mud, to a billionaire kneeling beside his old teacher. And then, something unexpected happened. Dozens of former cowboys, trainers, and ranch owners from across the American West began sending letters, photos, and videos of the animals they once loved. Unkept promises, unfinished memories. A movement began to spread beyond anyone's expectations. People began calling it the First Debt Campaign. From Montana to Nevada, from rodeo schools to local councils, the legacy of Toro Negro was rising again, not in blood and glory, but in gratitude and healing. That evening, Edward sat alone in a room filled with old relics, leather ropes, a photo from 1974, and the torn jacket he wore when he was still Harry from Amarillo. He looked out the window, toward the hill where Toro's grave now rested beneath a new sunset. And he whispered, "We started with a promise, Toro, but maybe we've sparked a movement." 3 weeks after Toro Negro's farewell, Winston Ranch was no longer just Edward's secluded land. It had become the nerve center of a national, perhaps even global, movement. A movement born from memory, honor, and the unspoken bond between humans and animals. The Toro Negro Foundation began receiving applications from across the United States, aging bulls, retired rodeo horses, even discarded herding dogs deemed no longer useful. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison stood amid the newly assembled veterinary team, scanning a list with over 200 cases. She turned to Edward, her expression a mix of concern and quiet inspiration. "Do you think we can actually do this? It's not just our story anymore." Edward sat silently by the window, holding an old photo of himself and young Toro, and nodded gently. "We can't heal the whole world, Elizabeth, but we can heal one part of its heart at a time." At that moment, the first documentary special, titled The Promise Keeper, aired on PBS. Millions watched, and among the quiet, powerful footage, there was one scene that moved viewers to tears. Edward sleeping beside Toro Negro, hand resting gently on the old bull's neck as it labored to breathe, as if he feared the creature might vanish if he let go. The narrator said only one sentence: "A billionaire, a bull, and a promise stronger than any financial legacy." The results came faster than anyone expected. Agricultural universities began introducing courses on post-career animal rights. Animal welfare groups pushed for new legislation on end-of-life dignity for working animals. In a Texas state council, a proposal was submitted to establish Toro Negro Day, a symbolic tribute to all animals who lived, fought, and gave their strength for humankind. One rainy afternoon, Edward and Elizabeth returned to Broken Arrow Ranch, the place where Miguel, Toro's old trainer, had lived, and where he kept Toro alive for decades, holding onto the fragile hope that Harold Winston would someday return. The ranch was now abandoned, but in one of the old barns, they discovered a charcoal sketch etched on the wall. A majestic black bull bowing beside a young man slumped over. Below it, scrawled in Spanish, La promesa no se olvida. The promise is never forgotten. Edward stood still for a long time. Then he turned to Elizabeth and said, "We're going to restore this place. It will be the first rescue center under the name Miguel Ramirez." She nodded. And for the first time since Toro's passing, Edward smiled, just a small smile. but a true one. 10 months after Toro Negro's passing, the land that was once merely a billionaire's retirement sanctuary had become a beacon of hope. A place where lives once discarded were now cared for with the reverence of a world beginning to awaken. By now, the Toro Negro Foundation had expanded its operations across 5 states, rescuing over 600 animals, not only bulls, but also retired rodeo horses, service dogs, and even aging circus elephants from defunct touring companies in Florida. At the heart of the main ranch, a bronze statue now stood. Toro Negro, his head bowed gently, as if bidding farewell to an old friend. Etched beneath it were the words, "He didn't just carry riders. He carried a legacy." Edward was now 79 years old. He walked more slowly, leaning on a wooden cane for balance. But his spirit, the one that had surged when he stepped across that steel fence and discovered the old bull still alive, had never burned brighter. A young reporter from the New York Times visited him for the one-year memorial of Toro's passing. She asked, "You're one of the 50 wealthiest people in America. Why spend your final years caring for animals close to death?" Edward looked at her for a long moment, then pointed toward the horizon, where a few young calves were leaping through the pasture. "Because once, I was a young man thrown from the back of a bull, lying in blood and dust, thinking my life was over. It was that bull, Toro, who made me choose to live differently. To be different. And now, I'm simply repaying that debt." Around the same time, Texas A&M University announced the creation of a prestigious scholarship named the Toro Negro Fellowship, awarded to veterinary students who commit to working with retired or rescued animals. The media called it a ripple born from a promise. One crisp autumn afternoon, Edward was invited to speak before the National Council on Animal Welfare. The hall fell silent as he began. "Some promises sound foolish. A promise to a bull, a dog, or an elephant. But never underestimate the moral weight of such promises. Because sometimes, it's the smallest ones that save the last part of our humanity." When he finished, the entire room rose to its feet, not for fame, but for truth spoken straight from the heart. Back at the ranch, Dr. Elizabeth Morrison stood quietly, gazing out across the golden evening fields. Among the newly rescued cattle from Nevada, one calf had been given a special name, Hijo del Toro, son of the bull. That calf bore a faint white marking on its forehead, not a crescent, but a soft curve, like a moon bending low to embrace the earth. The story of Edward and Toro Negro was no longer just a moving memory from the Texas countryside. It had spread across the globe, transcending borders, species, and even time itself. A simple promise, to save an old bull from slaughter, had become a symbol of loyalty, gratitude, and the sacred bond between humankind and the natural world. In Tokyo, a charity inspired by Edward was founded, Promise Fields, dedicated to sponsoring abandoned performance animals. In Nairobi, a baby elephant rescue center carved into a stone wall, to Toro Negro, who reminded humanity of its soul. In Paris, an art exhibition titled Les Yeux du Toro, The Eyes of Toro, drew tens of thousands of visitors, capturing the final tender moments between Edward and the legendary bull. But the greatest miracle happened back in the U.S. The Texas state legislature officially passed the Toro Act, a bill prohibiting the euthanization of retired performance animals without humane measures or a chance at rehabilitation. Over $30 million were raised in just 6 months to build 5 new sanctuaries called Toro's Pasture across traditional cowboy states. A former bull rider, once known for facing El Diablo, a spiritual successor to Toro Negro, wrote in a heartfelt editorial, "I used to believe this profession had only 2 endings. You fall, or you survive. Toro and Edward showed me there's a third. To be remembered because you kept your word." But the deepest change was quieter. A 10-year-old girl in Oklahoma wrote a letter to Edward. "I saw you and Toro online. Now, every time I see a hurt animal, I stop. I'm not rich like you, but I have time. I think that's one way to keep a promise." 2. And Edward, at 80 years old, he no longer traveled far. But every evening, he would sit beneath the great oak tree by Toro's Hill. As the sun slipped beneath the horizon, he would whisper, "You kept me alive. I kept my word. Now we belong to history, and to the future." On Toro's first death anniversary, Hundreds gathered at the ranch. Veterans on horseback arrived from Montana. A teenage boy of Latino heritage came with a toro tattoo on his chest. An elderly Japanese man brought a handwritten letter of thanks, his hands trembling with age. The ceremony was simple, no speeches, no music, just a minute of silence among the tall grass, where the wind blew softly, like the gentle breath of a promise fulfilled. The stone at Toro Negro's resting place. After 1 year, bore an added inscription. He was not just a bull. He was a bond, a promise, a bridge. As the story came to a close, Edward walked slowly toward the new shelter, where frail, aging cattle now stood beneath the shade. A reporter asked, "If you could relive one moment in your life, which would it be?" Edward smiled, his eyes distant. "The moment I saw Toro again. Not through the eyes of a boy chasing victory, but through the eyes of a man who knew that keeping a promise is the only thing that makes life truly worth living. And that was the moment the world bowed its head. Not before a legend, but before a friendship that reminded humanity of how good we were meant to be." Thank you for staying with us until the end of this deeply moving story about Edward and the legendary bull. Toro Negro. A promise that spanned half a century. A friendship that crossed species. And a lesson in honor that the modern world had nearly forgotten. Some stories don't need miracles. Only a heart that remembers. And a promise that's never abandoned. Edward didn't just save a life. He reignited a belief in millions. That loyalty, kindness, and memory still have a place in this world. If you've ever made a promise, no matter how small, no matter how late it may seem, remember this: a promise kept can save a soul. If you believe in kindness, please share this story. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel, so you won't miss more powerful human stories like this. And tell us in the comments, have you ever kept a promise for life? And if given the chance, who would you keep a promise to? Thank you for watching, and we'll see you on the next journey.